Hi everyone, I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. We seem to be at another one of these junctures where we need to clear the air in the face of this unprecedented pandemic. First came the denials about COVID-19. Then we all went into battle mode, learning social distancing, clapping for carers, reorganizing our lives under confinement. When the curve flattened and lockdown was eased, we thought we were seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But faced with a hitherto unknown coronavirus and an information age where everyone's an expert on social media, well, we're bombarded with contradictory information. As the likes of Spain, Serbia, Israel, Australia see parts or the entirety of their countries return to lockdown, as new pockets of contagion are still emerging, are we facing an endless nightmare, or is this the normal course of a pandemic in the age of globalization? Is the mortality rate dropping or not? How to juggle the balance between lives and livelihoods? We've had to keep asking the same questions on this show, well, because the answers often keep changing. What is clear is a strong divide over science, which mirrors a strong divide over belief in whether government and public health are part of the problem or part of the solution. Will this COVID culture war save us, kill us, or ultimately prove irrelevant in the face of a virus that does not discriminate according to political allegiance? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at return to lockdown in lots of places. Joining us from Brisbane, Australia, Kirsty, who is virologist at the University of Queensland. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
From Edinburgh in Scotland, BAULD, Professor of Public Health at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
From Madrid, Beatriz Perez Gomez, who is a preventive medicine and public health specialist at the National Center of Epidemiology at the Instituto de Salud Carlos III, and one of the co-authors of a study we'll be talking about in a moment, published in The Lancet, about, just how much herd immunity there's been. Spoiler, Beatriz, this isn't necessarily a very good news story you're going to tell us, is it?
I don't think it is a good story, no.
Okay. Here in the French capital, Matthew DALTON, who is correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, has been examining a trend in the US and in Europe, and wrote about it this week, about how perhaps cafe culture may be a plus when you're easing lockdown. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thanks, François.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, #F24debate. But first, let's talk about, the story that's been dominating the news for many. One of those who was among the biggest non-believers when it came to coronavirus, telling reporters during a live press opportunity that yes, he has coronavirus. We're of course talking about Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro.
The result turned out to be positive.
Acabou de dar positivo.
Deu positivo, então? Yes, it's positive.
E se agravou durante o dia de segunda-feira.
I was feeling lethargic, fatigued, a bit of muscle pain, and a fever that reached 38 degrees.
What was your reaction, Linda Bald, when you heard that news?
Well, I think Brazil, I was speaking to colleagues there last week, has been in an incredibly difficult position, and they've lacked leadership. And I think that to have head of government trying to advise people to use medicines, for example, that are not proven in their effectiveness, and then dismissing this virus and COVID-19 as not serious, when we know how serious it is, and it's very serious at the moment for the people of Brazil. So around the globe, we're seeing strong leadership to address the pandemic in some countries, but I don't think Brazil is one of them.
So this is, you agree, Matthew DALTON, a cautionary tale, a moral tale?
I don't know if it's a moral tale. It's definitely a cautionary tale. The Brazilian president has been one of the people who's been most dismissive of the risks of the coronavirus epidemic. I think he's been skeptical of wearing masks also, which is supported by a lot of public health evidence to prevent infection. So I wouldn't say, I certainly wouldn't want to say he had it coming, but I think it just illustrates how wrong his message has been.
And yet, Kirsty Short, we all know that this isn't going to move the needle a whole lot, is it, this piece of information? Despite all the work you do in the lab, there are going to be those who are still going to believe what Jair Bolsonaro has been saying up to now.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the major problems that we've had in this pandemic. And it's really about communication, because fundamentally it is hard to communicate the latest science and the latest advancements anyway to the general public. But on top of that, there's been so much we don't know about this virus. So we as scientists have been struggling every day, just learning new things and communicating the latest information. And so I think that this should be really a warning for future pandemics, dare I say it, that really public communication and helping people understand the science behind all these lockdowns and all these decisions is really key.
Yeah, and that brings us to that study we were talking about at the outset with you, Beatriz Perez Gomez. You went out and surveyed 30,000 people in Spain, effective study.
No, we surveyed 61,000 people.
Thank you for the correction. 61. Why did I read 30?
Yeah.
61,000 people.
Can I say something about Bolsonaro?
Go for it.
He should be under isolation. He's a positive case, and he's with the press out there. He's not doing the right thing, just in person.
Yeah, he should be spending 14 days in isolation at least?
Yeah, he should be in isolation because he's a positive case. He shouldn't be doing what he's doing now. He's been a risk for the other people around. Taking that aside and going back again to the study, what we did was we were asking ourselves the same thing that everybody was asking. We had a very heavy pandemic in Spain with a lot of people getting ill. So the question that it was hanging around was how many people has been sick? How many people has been infected by the virus, as we are having such big problems with the amount that we are seeing, and we know that we are not diagnosing everyone because we with the problems and the organization and the resources and the crisis, there is not enough test for everyone.
So Beatrice, let me break this down, and sorry to second guess you along the way here every time, just to be sure. First of all, the serology test that you did, the test for antibodies, is it effective? Do you believe in it?
Yes, I do, because we didn't use one. We used two, and we tested them first. We made a specific test to estimate their specificity and their sensibility. They work quite well, and then we used two different tests, and so we could use a very conservative approach that was to take into account those people that were positive for both tests, as well as a sensitive approach in which we could only consider those who were positive in either one of the tests. We wanted to be very sure.
The result you get is, in some areas, the ones least affected, Spain, one of the countries in Europe that had the biggest impact of coronavirus at the outset, a drastic lockdown, 3% who test positive. In some of the harder hit areas, an average of 7%. This is endless. We're not going to see a second wave. This is the first wave that's going to last forever, it seems.
Yeah, I think so. Well, there is a lot of debate in the scientific community around about which is really measuring when you get to measure immunity through antibodies, and which is the role of another kind of immunity, which depends on cells like T lymphocytes. We get, as Christine was saying, there is a lot of things we don't know yet in this epidemic. But if you take into account what we can measure right now, which is antibodies, between 3% and 7% of the people in Spain have been exposed to the virus. So there is a huge amount of people that have not gone through the disease or have not contacted the virus yet. So there is a lot of people that might be susceptible to it.
All right, Linda BAULD, of course, that brings us to, I guess I'll call the Sweden question, or in your case, perhaps the Boris Johnson question. You remember the UK Prime Minister back in March who talked up herd immunity. It seems as though to get to herd immunity, you'd have had to wait a very long time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And in fact, in an accompanying editorial in The Lancet to the excellent paper we were just hearing about from Spain, it does also point to data from Sweden, where, as you know, the strategy has been more to keep the economy, premises, businesses, and educational settings open, with the potential that herd immunity would be built up. In other words, more people would come into contact with the virus and more people would develop some immunity. But that Lancet commentary editorial shows that even in Sweden, it's less than 10%, even in urban areas, who have any antibodies. In the UK, in the beginning of the pandemic, as we were hearing from Kirsty before, the science isn't certain and there's disagreement between scientists, so we had conflicting scientific advice to our government. And it's absolutely clear that in the early days there was a section of the advising community who thought that herd immunity was the way to go. And in fact, there still are scientists who think we should pursue that. But I think as we move through this pandemic, we're seeing that it's not the best strategy, even though there are many countries for whom hard lockdowns over long periods are not sustainable. So it's really, really tricky, but I think that concept is being gradually debunked.
Kirsty Shore, what is the answer?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. I mean, I think there is still a lot that we need to know. At the moment, what's really a sort of big knowledge gap for us is that we don't understand what mediates protection against this virus. So is it that if you have antibodies, you're protected from reinfection? Or if so, how long do these antibodies last? Is it, as was mentioned before, a different aspect of your immune response that isn't measured in these antibody assays? So maybe the news is more positive than we think it is. The sheer reality of a pandemic is that we hadn't heard of this virus 6 months ago. So we're learning so much every day. And hopefully the answer is more knowledge, more research, and then implementing that into public policy.
Matthew Dalton, that brings us to the piece you wrote for the Wall Street Journal, where you picked up on the fact that we are seeing a dramatic spike in the US's Sunbelt, places like Arizona, Florida, Texas, whereas here in Europe, since the easing of confinement, we haven't seen a dramatic spike, albeit, we'll talk about it in a moment, there are second lockdowns in places. And if I could put it down in 2 words, air conditioning is a main ingredient in all of that?
Well, it's unclear how much of an ingredient it is, and it's not air conditioning per se, it's the lack of fresh air. So in the US Sunbelt, where it's much hotter than it is in Florida, Texas, Arizona, other states across the southern half of the United States, it's much hotter than it is in Europe, across the entire continent. And so people really to go out and to go outside of their houses and to eat in restaurants, they need to be in air-conditioned spaces. It's just very hard to tolerate that kind of heat without it. And when people run the air conditioning, they close the windows, and that creates conditions where there's not enough fresh air and ventilation moving through through these indoor spaces. What the experts say that I spoke to is that it's possible that the viral load is building up in the air in those indoor spaces and fueling transmission. And so Europe has the advantage that people can go to restaurants and sit inside in restaurants with the windows and doors wide open because the summers are relatively mild here. And so this is going to be a problem, I think, in the United States over the summer, where large parts of the country do absolutely need air conditioning for you to be inside. And people are talking about, well, maybe we need to change the settings on air conditioning to facilitate having more fresh air, because most air conditioning systems, they recycle almost most or all of the air to save energy costs. And so that really creates a situation where you're just not getting enough ventilation through spaces where there are a lot of people occupying the space. And that's the problem.
Kirsty Short, do you agree air conditioning kills?
I don't think it's really about air conditioning. As was just said, I think it's really about indoor spaces versus outdoor spaces. And what we're seeing is that the risk of transmission in outdoor spaces is quite low. And we've seen this all play out with the Black Lives Matter movement, that actually there's been a limited number of cases that have been traced back to those protests. And probably the saving grace of those protests is the fact that they were outside. So this really tells us a lot about viral spread, but it also gives us some useful information about how to reduce the risk of spread if you do have to meet with an individual face-to-face.
Linda Ball, do you remember that hot day 10 days ago when everybody went to the beach in Bournemouth in southern England? What's happened since? It's too early to tell?
Yeah, very little. I mean, that might be too early to tell, but it's not too early, Francois, to think back to VE Day, for example, in the UK, when there were street parties and other gatherings. That's way back many weeks ago. We've definitely, as Kirsty's saying, we've not seen rises that we can link back to outdoor social gatherings or outdoor protests. And I think it absolutely is the case. It's because they're outdoors. But of course, what we're going to see as we go into the autumn and winter months in the UK, as we were just hearing, we can open the windows now in restaurants and bars when they reopen. They're not open yet in Scotland. But as things get colder, we're going to be more indoors with windows closed, trying to keep warm. And that is a real concern in terms of future spikes here in this country.
Does that mean we have to just sit tight and wait for that eventual vaccine that may or may not work?
Well, I think all of us are waiting for two things, and the scientific community is working at speed, and funders are contributing significant resources to better treatments. And of course, we've seen one already licensed. And secondly, a vaccine potentially. We're very uncertain about that still. But no, we can't just wait for those. We have to live alongside the virus. And that's why the public health response, the test, trace, isolate, the giving guidance to people, including on the risks associated with different environments, the social or physical distancing, those are the things we just must implement until science helps us out with some of the bigger questions.
Yeah, that brings us to the discussion about this wave of new lockdowns that we're witnessing. Last week, it was first Catalonia and now Galicia, where you are, Beatriz Perez Gomez. This happening just as you're getting set to publish that study. What was your reaction?
Well, in fact, there is nothing that could avoid small lockdowns. I don't think we can avoid that, because public health has always been underfunded, and the contact tracing and isolation that was previously mentioned is basic in an environment with such a low protection among the people. So when you get one case and you are not able to isolate it very quickly, you get transmission. And in Galicia and in Catalonia, they are implementing small area lockdowns, waiting to see if this approach is enough to cut the spread of the disease.
And in the case of Galicia, that lockdown is short indeed, because, well, they're going to reopen so that they can have local elections on the 12th of July. Not everyone, as you're about to hear, is pleased.
Me parece que la medida sí se debe de tomar, pero no debe de tomarse 5 días. Lo que hay que es que prolongar, porque se ha visto que es por las elecciones. ¿En 5 días se va a acabar esto? Lo que hay que tomar es medidas serias, y si se toma, pues se toma a los días que hagan falta.
Beatriz Perez Gomez, should they be holding local elections in Galicia?
They have already stopped them before because of the coronavirus. I don't think there is a lot of legal support to not to have them. Either way, they have to find a way to make the elections sure and safe. And it has not been, in France, you have had elections with coronavirus There must be a way to make it safe for the people, but they must have also the opportunity to choose their leaders.
Beatriz Perez Gomez, I know you have to leave us early for health and safety reasons of a different kind. There's a gas leak in your neighborhood. So
yes,
thank you for
I'm
joining
sorry.
us. I'll let
sorry
you go.
very much. Thank you, and sorry, and have a good day. That is public health too.
That's public health indeed. Matthew Dalton, we saw some violent demonstrations in Belgrade, capital of Serbia. That's because they're going into a second lockdown there. People are angry because confinement was eased so that elections could be held. Elections won by the incumbent leader back in June. Ahead of those elections, there were things like concerts and rallies. And people are furious now that they're having to return to lockdown, saying it was careless. Again, we're discovering with this pandemic just how much medicine is political.
Well, I think you can have local elections, as France has shown, and it doesn't seem like there's been that has prompted a surge of new cases. It kind of depends how you do it. You can have the elections themselves. People go in, wear masks into the voting areas and then leave. Don't hang around. But if you do allow things like rallies and concerts in indoor spaces, confined indoor spaces where you have a lot of people gathering together, that's the recipe for transmission. So there's a smart way to do elections and there's a dumb way to do elections. And I didn't see exactly what Serbia did, but it could be that they did the dumb way of doing elections.
And so now they're returning into lockdown. You mentioned those confined spaces, Matthew. That, of course, brings to mind right away what's going on in the United States. Donald Trump has restarted rallies. He says he's wearing a mask, but he's not wearing it. We haven't seen him wear one so far. Again, this culture war continues to play out despite the evidence. Why is that?
Well, I think it starts with President Trump himself. I think he has been, the other people on the show talked about the importance of communication during the crisis, and his communication has been very skeptical of some of the public health measures that experts believe prevent transmission, and chief among those is a mask. And he's allowed, for example, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the head of the top U.S. epidemiologist, to speak about this and to recommend the masks. But then he's come out and said, "Well, I'm not going to require it, or I'm not sure I'm going to wear a mask." Now he says he's wearing a mask, but we haven't seen him do it. So the messaging has been very unclear. And then when you're holding political rallies with gathering a lot of people in an inside space, that's also, everyone believes, all the experts believes that is a high risk activity.
And that air conditioning that we talked about before, is that now part of the culture war?
I hope not. It could be. Could become part of the culture war. Again, it's not air conditioning per se. It's being in a confined space. And air conditioning does not ventilate a space. It just cools it. Most air conditioning systems do not bring in much or any fresh air into an indoor space. So I think, air conditioning is one of those things that we Americans, we like our air conditioning. And I know a lot of Europeans go to America and say that, we even keep our rooms too cold. So maybe there is space for us to open the windows more and rely less on air conditioning. But, in Florida in July, and Arizona in July, I think it's really oppressive.
All right, and the arguments over second lockdowns, they're providing a whole batch of stories where Kirsty Short is in Australia. The front page of the Australian this Wednesday, back to square one, what with Melbourne and its surrounding regions in lockdown mode once again, travel restricted from one state to the other. The Prime Minister says he's got this.
The issue is what the overall level of returning Australians are, and that's why I'll be bringing a proposal on Friday to reduce that load, which means that's a lesser load for everybody, rather than shifting Western Australia's load onto someone else. With Melbourne shut down from that point of view, then taking on higher burdens is what we're seeking to avoid.
Kirsty Short, of course, then we have news that on the one hand, people who find this too draconian. On the other hand, we have stories like the one of a passenger jet plane that went from Melbourne to another part of the country in Sydney with no health checks in it. Your thoughts on how it's all going where you are?
Yeah, look, Australia's been in a really unusual position in this pandemic in that we've largely escaped the worst of it insofar as, you know, we've only had 104 deaths since the pandemic began. So it's actually been very, very mild here. I think the risk of that is that it breeds a little bit of complacency. And we're still exposed to the risk because we still have overseas Australians returning home from countries where there are high levels of coronavirus. And so that's sort of what sparked the Melbourne outbreak in that, you know, and you've got to feel for people because this is unprecedented. You know, we've never had to deal with this situation before. So that ended up leading to an outbreak, and I think the government's doing 100% the right thing, locking down. All the people in Melbourne are obviously disappointed, but I think people are taking a very reasonable attitude to it, saying that, well, we've done this once, we can do this again. And yes, at the moment we have interstate borders, and so you can't really leave Victoria now. But again, I think this is a reasonable approach, and it may seem draconian, but these are the public health measures that work, and this is what we have to depend on.
Kirsty Short, you yourself, you say, have family in Melbourne. Do you get this sense? And it was the question I put earlier to Beatriz Perez Gomez when she looked at the results of her studies, that it's very hard to find that light at the end of the tunnel.
I guess I'm quite optimistic about everything in relation to this coronavirus, simply because I do fundamentally, I've seen the science. I've seen how fast the science is moving. I do fundamentally believe we will get a vaccine. And I don't think that this will be a situation that's going to go on forever. So I think at the moment, we've just got to do what we can, protect as many people as we can, and follow the appropriate scientific and government advice. But I don't think we're going to be stuck like this for the next 10 years.
Linda Ball, do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. The solution to this will come from science. I completely agree. My colleagues, as I say, are working at speed. So we don't know a timeline for vaccine, but we know there are many studies actively recruiting in terms of human participants in those. That's growing all the time. We have active trials here in the UK, but many other countries as well. So I'm sure we will get there. But just to go back to what I said before, I'm also optimistic about treatments because, of course, most people who come into contact with this virus are very mildly affected, but we know the groups from multiple cohort studies now who are badly affected, underlying conditions, older people. Those are the people who, if they do come into contact with the virus and develop COVID-19, if we can provide them with effective treatment, particularly early in the pathway, that's also a really huge step forward.
Is the mortality rate going down? Because there too, I've seen, Linda, contradictory opinions.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was speaking this morning to colleagues from India, and I don't know how closely you're following what's happening in South Asia, but what appears to be the case in India, and also to some extent in Bangladesh and Pakistan as well, is you have high numbers of cases, but low mortality rates. Now, of course, they're not catching all the cases. We don't know how many there are, but mortality seems to be lower, we think, in some parts of the world than others. Now, that's related to the profile of the population, for example, a younger population, etc. And so I think in the fullness of time, we'll have a better sense. But the take-home message is, this is a virus that will kill people, and that's why we put in place all these measures. But some groups are far more badly affected than others.
Some are more badly affected than others. Then there's the case of Israel, which is returning to lockdown, and a lot of people are quite angry. The Jerusalem Post headlining on the resignation of the director of public health at the health ministry, Sigal Sadeki, saying that there's a problem there again of leadership. Too much time invested in debates, discussions, consultations, and forums, while the operations and details required for the success of the various operations do not receive the proper attention, she says. Matthew Dalton, in Israel, there's, for instance, been too much faith, it seems, put in their digital phone app. That might sound familiar to you, has been covering how badly that's gone here in France, saying that those digital apps, well, they don't work that well when you live, for instance, in an apartment block. Instead, what you need is good old-fashioned human beings to make what we call here in France those sanitary brigades that check up and contact trace.
Yeah, that's right. I think if you're depending on the app to monitor the spread of the coronavirus, there's no evidence really, and there's no examples of that working well. And fundamentally, we're still somewhat uncertain as to how much contact you need to have between people for infection to occur. So, and in a city, people are passing by each other all the time. And so, you could basically, if one person is infected, you could have, the app could turn up thousands of potential people that the person has infected. So, yeah, you do need the physical contact tracing put in place to really stop a cluster in its tracks. So if Israel has been depending on the app to do that, that's probably a mistake.
There seems to be a trend, has there not, Linda BAULD, where in countries where people feel as though perhaps government isn't always part of the solution, like we were talking about Brazil or the United States currently, where there's less perhaps trust in public health authorities, it makes it a lot harder to get those sanitary brigades up and running, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So I think you made two really important points there. The first one is from a behavioral science perspective. Trust in the messenger, trust in government is really key in terms of compliance. And in the UK, we've got different governments and different levels. And in Scotland, we have a very good communicator as a First Minister, and her approval ratings are incredibly high, and our case numbers are low here. And we're heading to, we're trying to eliminate the virus in Scotland. Whether we'll be successful, I don't know. So trust in leadership is part of it, but also in terms of setting up contact tracing infrastructure, leaving the app to one side. Government's abilities to recognize the threat that the virus posed and to reinvest in public health infrastructure, which I think Kirsty was saying earlier has been, or one of us was, has been underinvested in many, many countries. You need that public health infrastructure to get the basic contact tracing up and running, and that's been very mixed. Germany's been brilliant. The UK was far too late to the table with that response.
How much trust is there in the government to make the right decisions where you are in Australia, Kirsty Short?
Yeah, look, I think we had a bit of a unique situation because just before coronavirus broke out, we had devastating bushfires throughout Australia. And there it was really seen that the government dropped the ball a lot, and there was a lot of criticism. So I think that was really a learning curve for the government, that they need to take action, and they need to take action fast. And actually, I think they've done a really, really good job in this pandemic. Firstly, we had travel restrictions in place in January. We had a pandemic preparedness plan. We had all these stages being implemented, scientific consultation. So I think that's played a really big role in why we've largely been able to contain the virus, with the exception of this sort of flare-up in Melbourne that's happened over the last few weeks.
COVID-19 looming large over the government reshuffle we've seen here in France, Matthew Dalton. The new Prime Minister speaking before Parliament for the first time since his appointment. And he says he's going to reach conclusions with a talk shop with all those involved in the health sector before the end of this week. Would you say that trust in the government to do the right thing when it comes to things like contact tracing is on the rise, or is it going down?
I think I don't know if it's going up or down. I think it's pretty high in France right now. I think, the Macron's government is unpopular, and Macron himself is unpopular, and he's kind of pretty widely disliked by the public. But I think people do trust French scientists and the French bureaucracy to do a pretty good job dealing with this, and I think they have done a good job. The new Prime Minister this morning in an interview said that they've got a plan ready to do reconfinement if there's a second wave, but it's going to be more targeted. It's not going to be the general reconfinement, the general confinement that we had in the first, in March and April. So, hopefully it doesn't come to that, but hopefully if there is a second wave, a more targeted reconfinement will work.
You spoke, Kirsty Short, about the positives we've seen, most notably in helping treatment. Again, the mortality rate for you, is it going down? Is it steady? The data is patchy because we haven't tested the whole of this planet's population. So what do we know?
Yeah, look, the mortality rate is really partly a feature of how good a country's testing is, because obviously if a country isn't testing very much, then you'll have a high mortality rate proportion to the number of individuals infected. It's also reflective, as was said before, of the country's population dynamics, and countries who inherently have an older population, perhaps an older population with a high rate of comorbidities, like things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity. These are all things that increase the severity of the virus. So I think it's actually going to be a long time until we get a reliable feel for this mortality rate. And we shouldn't expect this mortality rate to be the same in every country, nor should we expect it to be the same in every population. And we've seen that in every single past pandemic that's happened in human history. There is no one general mortality rate because it's so dependent on all these host, environmental, and socioeconomic factors.
And what about the virus itself, Kirsty? Is it mutating, as some say?
Yeah, so this is one of the really incredible things about coronaviruses. So before this pandemic, I focused exclusively on flu viruses. And flu viruses mutate like crazy. This is why every year we have to get a new flu vaccine, because the virus has mutated so much, it's changed to evade that vaccine. Coronaviruses are really, really slow to mutate. So actually what's been surprising is we've only seen a limited number of mutations emerging in this virus. And to date, there's no strong scientific evidence that any of these mutations have any effect on disease severity. There's maybe slight evidence that maybe one mutation may affect transmission, but again, that's still not established, and it's just incredibly limited number of mutations. So this is a really good thing, because this means that hopefully if we can get a vaccine, it can potentially provide long-lasting protection rather than a scenario of like what we have with seasonal flu, where we need these yearly updates.
Linda BAULD, let me ask you for advice before we go. Where should we be getting our news? When headlines in the newspapers after a star dancer dies with no pre-existing condition at the age of 41, the headlines read that the virus is affecting younger people more. Where can we get reliable news on how much we know?
Well, a bit like Kirsty, before this pandemic started, I worked on more broader controversial public health topics in prevention, where there's a lot of myths circulating around alcohol, e-cigarettes, lots of different things. So I always say, look for the reputable providers. In terms of sources of information, the World Health Organization, public health agencies in countries, health service support that's available online. Those are the best sources of information. This is a health topic for people to access. And then when we come into the media, we need to make sure that we're not getting our information from lots of different sources that we're not sure about. Again, go to providers that we think are more well established and have journalists who know what they're talking about. But for basic information, I really would try and rely on reputable health authorities, particularly if people are unwell and looking for advice and wanting to know what to do. That's absolutely key.
And what about when you have, we saw the news of the past 24 hours with Donald Trump officializing the fact that the US is leaving the World Health Organization. We saw a debate within the WHO with a group of scientists penning an open letter saying, yes, the disease can be airborne, contradicting earlier statements, the WHO reversing itself slightly. Does that mean the WHO doesn't know what it's doing, or does that mean we misunderstand what the role of the WHO is?
I think we misunderstand the role of the WHO. I must emphasize, WHO does not always get it right. Again, going back to other topics, they're not always on top of the evidence, etc. They are a cautious organization, and their purpose is to serve to provide a global response. It's not to serve particular countries, etc. So you'll see them being cautious, and they won't shift until they're really very confident. For example, look at the issue of masks, where I think they were probably too late to the table in terms of giving clear advice. But they did change their guidance, and that's excellent that they have. And I think the evidence on airborne transmission is interesting. We're all watching that, and we'll see where the WHO goes with it. But in a global crisis, these intergovernmental agencies are what we have. We need a global response. And for countries to withdraw their support at this stage, I find deeply unhelpful.
We'll leave it there. I want to thank you so much for joining us, Linda BAULD in Edinburgh. I want to thank Kirsty Shore for being with us from Brisbane, Matthew Dalton in Paris. We want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. There's much more on our website, france24.com, as well as Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel. Bye for now.